The mail coach stopped with a sigh of brakes and dust, and she tasted the iron of the desert on her tongue. Her hair was pinned up with clips that bit into her scalp, and the borrowed dress stank of old soap and well water. When she opened her mouth to ask for Mr. Tomás Beltrán, the noise of the town shrank half an inch and then broke into fine laughter like goat's hooves on stone. Her accent came out sung, rounder than the rocks of the ravine where she had learned to whistle messages as a child. And in San Miguel del Viento, that song sounded like mockery. The man who was supposed to receive her, tall, mustache waxed, vest with a watch chain that wanted to look like gold, looked at her as if he smelled salted fish and said, without touching her outstretched hand, "I wrote that I wanted a decent wife, not a songbird. I don't understand half of what you're saying." She swallowed dust with her pride, dug in her bag for the letter folded 4 times, the one that had crossed the Atlantic and the deserts with its promise of a home, and held it between her fingertips like a wounded bird. He twisted his mouth. "Don't bother, miss. Your voice doesn't fit in this house." And with a brusque gesture, he left a small packet of coins on the station table, payment for the journey and for the shame. No hand was offered to her, except one, brown, with fine scars on the knuckles from pulling reins, that pushed the gawkers aside and gave the newcomer the shadow of a wing. The owner of that hand didn't smile, but patience like a river walked in his eyes. She traced the line of that arm up to his face, a cowboy in a faded poncho, jaw shaved that same day, lips split by the sun. He stood still, but the horse behind him lowered its head as if obeying a thought. "Ma'am," the cowboy said, "if you need water, the cantina's across the street." She nodded, and a soft gracias came out of her, with that gentle Z sound that drags sea sand, and the cowboy only tilted his head a little, like a man who hears thunder very far away. She walked with the hard suitcase, the dress slapping her calves, dust climbing up inside her. The cantina sign hung from a tired chain and said El Reparo. Inside it smelled of leather, stew, and warm beer. The owner, a woman with high hair and strong arms, set the pitcher down on the bar and measured the newcomer from head to toe. Isora, because that was her name, Isora Morales, from the island of La Gomera. 22 years old and more sea than roof, bit her lower lip and said she was looking for work for a little while, just until she understood where she could drop dead. The barwoman wiped her hands on her apron and answered, "If you know how to wash glasses and pretend you don't hear bragging, you're family already." And she rapped the bar 3 times with her knuckles, a sound that rang like a welcome. That night, after closing, when the last drunk fell asleep on the table like a tired cow, Isora went out to the backyard with a bucket of water and sat on the threshold. The sky looked like a dark hide stretched over bones. The desert breathed. She pulled out her kerchief and, almost from cave habit, brought her fingers to her lips and whistled, high and deep, with the technique her grandfather had left her like an inheritance of air. The notes crossed the yard and bounced off the walls, clear. A couple of goats in the back answered with a drowsy bleat. She smiled without teeth, the shadow of a smile, and then heard the jingle of a spur. The cowboy from the station was standing in the doorway, still so as not to startle her. He didn't applaud, didn't joke. He took off his hat with the smallest turn of his wrist. "Was that to call stars, or to talk to someone?" he asked. "So I don't forget I'm not mute," he said. "You're not," he replied. "Your voice makes the world softer, and I'm not saying that to be polite. I'm saying it because the horse felt it." She looked down at her hands, still shaking from the day, and didn't know what to do with a compliment that didn't open a wound. "I'm Elias Rivas," the cowboy added. "If any man tries to buy you for the price of a mule, call me." She fixed her eyes on him, steady. She wanted no more saviors who treated her like a debt. "I call myself, thank you." He nodded, taking the blow the way you take grit between your teeth. He let out a whistle of his own, very low, between his teeth, proof that he had heard the speech without words and maybe understood its usefulness. Then he left. The days that followed were a rite of learning another chore. Isora washed dishes until her wrists burned, learned the rhythm of the out-of-tune upright piano, dodged hands with experience and a well-placed elbow, and let her accent do its work like water. Wear things down without asking permission. Every night at closing, she whistled to the sky, and some kid from town, a Chinijo, would creep closer, laughing at first and then curious, until he sat on the ground beside her. One of them, Nico, an orphan in an oversized cap, imitated her stubbornly. She corrected the position of his tongue, set her hand on his nape to adjust the angle, and the sound began to come out clean. The whistle crossed the street and climbed onto the roofs like a cat. In the third week, a woman got off the train with a hatbox and blue eyes that smelled of business. Her name was Mrs. Keene, and she carried a notebook full of photographs of ladies and widowers. Folks called her the matchmaker, and the more respectable sort hurried to invite her to tea. Isora watched her from afar, from behind the bar, gripping the rag. The matchmaker spoke decent Spanish, but there was something in the way she slotted her phrases together that sounded like an echo. Every letter she showed the men in town came with the same refrain: home, respect, hot bread on the table. Pretty words that could have belonged to anyone. The mayor and judge, Don Lucio Castañeda, came down from his office in his perfect frock coat and knife-blade smile, and welcomed her like a man greeting a supplier of nails. He shook her hand with soft fingers and announced, for anyone who cared to listen, that San Miguel del Viento was going to leave barbarism behind and that respectable families would rise with this new wind. Isora listened and pressed her lips together. The airy, respectable families usually meant someone else would pay the bill. That night, at the gambler's table, a drunk with ink-stained fingers sat down to eat soup and let slip that he was tired of copying nonsense for women who don't exist. Isora served him bread and didn't ask questions, but later she went to him out in the yard, offered him a cigarette, and by the fourth drag the man was talking without anyone having to pry him open. It's the mayor who dictates the letters, you know, and the English lady arranges the matches. I just write them out clean. Sometimes they change the widower's name, sometimes they don't even bother. And anyway, by the time the women get here, they're already tied to the deal. Because where are they going to go? Her body went cold, like someone had thrown well water over her. The man had no reason to lie, and the phrase, "Where are they going to go?" was a club she recognized in her bones. Isora went back to the tiny room where she slept, pulled out her bundle of letters, all the ones she'd gotten from Tomas, and spread them on the bed like cards. She read slowly, letting her ear do its work. There was a beat that repeated, a cadence of a man who was not the fat shopkeeper who had despised her at the station. It was another voice, with hard R's, too polished for a small-town storekeeper, and every letter ended on the same picture, hot bread on the table. She closed her eyes and heard the mayor in the plaza saying those very words that same afternoon. The coincidence was no proof, but it was a clue. She felt like vomiting and swallowed the vomit and her pride with water. She went to find Elias in the corral, not out of a need for a savior, but because he had friends who didn't drink just to get through the day. She found him shoeing a dun horse, balancing on one foot, and his own patience. "I need to get into Castañeda's office," she blurted, without greeting. Elias didn't look up from the nail. "What for?" "To find something that turns me into more than a funny story." He hammered. The nail went home. The horse snorted. "If there's dynamite inside, courage won't be enough." "There won't be dynamite," she said. "There will be ink." Elias looked at her then and saw in her eyes that dry shine that belongs to people who learn to walk with forgetting on their backs. He nodded, and when night fell they went with two more shadows. Carmela, the barwoman, who knew the night watchman's routine, and Han, the Chinese blacksmith, silent as a well-made wire. Nico, the orphan, insisted on following at a distance. "No," she said, but he tailed them anyway. Because children obey best the things they aren't ordered. The mayor's office smelled of wax and paper. The back window was badly latched. Hans slid in a piece of iron like a comb through a braid and nudged it open. Inside, shelves rose in stacks of labeled boxes. Carmela stayed at the door with a sawed-off shotgun, just in case. Elias held the lamp. Izora walked straight to the desk like she'd known that house since childhood. The third drawer wanted a lock. Han persuaded it with a small hook. Inside, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, men's names on the covers. Izora recognized her own by the bluish ink the ship's damp air had bitten into. The margins bore the trace of a wet seal she hadn't noticed before. At the back of the drawer lay a ledger, with columns marked hospitality expenses and donations to the courthouse. Miners' names, round sums, dates that lined up with train arrivals. Izora pressed the ledger to her chest and felt her breath splitting her ribs. Suddenly, footsteps. Carmela hissed, "Up." Elias took the lamp. Izora the book. Han shut the drawer with a soft thump. They hid among the cabinets like cats inside an organ. The mayor came in with a foreman, spoke in whispers, but the walls were generous. "Tomorrow we open the floodgates," Castaneda said. "The river quarter goes under mud, and no one cries over shacks with no title. My people get water for the mill, and Keen brings women who don't ask questions." Izora's stomach loosened. The foreman chewed tobacco and spat on the floor. "And if someone complains?" "To whom?" the mayor laughed. "To the wind?" They left, and the quiet filled up with heartbeat. Elias touched Isora's shoulder once. They slipped out the window with the same care they'd used to get in. When they reached the street, Nico peeled himself out of a shadow. "I heard everything." "You didn't need to hear," she murmured. "I'm poor, ma'am. I don't have luxury ears." She laughed in spite of everything at the absurd truth of that phrase. The plan was born of hunger. There weren't enough horses to warn every ranch on the floodplain. The road to the dam was a maze of canyons. A rider would take hours, a whistle as long as a heartbeat. Isora looked at Nico, at Carmela, at Elias, and said, "The shepherds talk to each other with whistles from one hill to the next. I can teach you codes in no time. If every hill repeats them, we warn everyone in 20 minutes." Carmela crossed herself in a hurry. "They'll call it witchcraft." "They can call it what they like," Isora said. "If the water hits them, they'll call it too late." Elias fixed his eyes on her. "Are you sure they'll listen to you?" "No." "Then we have to make the sound something nobody can argue with." Elias fetched a cow horn they used to move cattle. Han tempered a metal plate to turn it into something that would multiply the resonance. Meanwhile, Isora rounded up the kids who listened to her every night, showed them with gestures where to put their tongues, how to tune to the bell of the palate. Her fingers touched napes, jaws, cheekbones, and in under an hour, the yard sounded like big birds. She sketched maps with charcoal on the ground, drew hills like hunks of bread, assigned signals. 3 long whistles for danger of water, 2 short and 1 long for climb to the hill, and a sharp trill for open the southern gate. The children repeated them. Carmela, shotgun in arm, made sure no one snooped. Han brought the horn. Elias tried it. The sound slammed into the walls and came back stronger. At dawn, the wind dropped with the smell of wet stone. The clouds had wedged themselves into the ranges like stubborn sheep. Izora climbed the church tower, legs trembling, and with the horn and her mouth, began preaching in her own tongue. A hymn of alarm that danced over ravines and cornfields. The kids on the hills answered. 1, 2, 3, and another farther off replied, and another, and the chain stretched like it had been waiting all along. Izora heard her codes multiply and felt a pride that didn't resemble the kind of pride men with medals talk about, but the pride of a woman baking bread out of air. Halfway through the concert, a shadow moved below at the foot of the tower. The mayor's men were charging with rifles. Carmela fired into the air, and that alone froze their knees. Elias appeared with 3 cowboys and the fierce calm of lightning. The foreman tried bravado. "What you're doing is a crime." "Which one?" she asked from above, refusing to come down. "Meddling in men's business." "I'm meddling in water's business." Elias smiled without showing teeth, and the foreman stepped back like he'd glimpsed flame. Far away, Very far, Isora heard the sharp trill she'd assigned to the southern gate. Someone up there was opening it. The sound of the dam began like a rumor you can't tell is thunder or a stomach, and then turned into a roar. The water tore out along the mouth that didn't point at the shacks. The earth drank. The street took one long breath, the sheep bleated, and the river quarter did not drown. Castañeda arrived late, frock coat splashed, eyes of a man searching for a culprit he could fit in his pocket. He climbed to the plaza, claimed authority. This is sedition. This is... But people looked at him like you look at a mirror that shows you someone else's face. Isora came down slowly from the tower with the ledger pressed under her dress, stepped up close, small body to elegant man, and said in an ordinary voice, no horn, the simplest knife. Your letters and your bribes bear your hand. And today's plan, your signature. He leaned in, not to hear better, but to sniff out fear. He found stones instead. You don't know how to read the law, woman, but I know how to read its rhythm. She took out her letters, the ones from the fake suitor, and read out loud the closing line from one, then another, always the same phrase, hot bread on the table. Then she looked at the crowd and whistled that same phrase in her ravine language, twice, until it turned into a sweet mockery. Someone in the crowd laughed. The mayor changed color. He tried to snatch the book from her. Elias stepped between them, without saying excuse me, in a movement that made no noise. Castañeda spat. That jabber of yours isn't worth enough to scare chickens. Men talk like men here. The men you manufacture, Carmela said, don't talk, they bark orders. And they pay in little columns, Han added, holding up a shortened copy of a page from the ledger, with figures even a child could make sense of. The mayor backed off. He was used to paper fights, not this strange mix of public shame and proof. He went for one last swing, snapped his fingers at his men. The foreman raised his gun at Elias. There was a shot. The dun horse jumped without its rider, like it knew it had permission to run. Elias dropped to his knees, a flower of blood blooming on his shoulder. A clean, cold feeling swept through Isora, and she didn't scream. She pressed the wound tight with her kerchief, while the air filled with weapons. The mayor's men raised more guns, and the town did the unthinkable. The old men dragged out shotguns that had slept under beds. Children picked up stones, and the balance shifted. No second shot was fired. The foreman looked around and saw that for the first time, the plaza didn't belong to his boss. He dropped his weapon. Others followed. Silence seeped back into every crack like water. Someone rode up from the south, wearing a brass badge that smelled of government. He was a marshal passing through, with 2 deputies and a hunger for glory. Castañeda smiled at him like a man greeting salvation, but the man with the star smelled the blood in the dust, saw the ledger in Isora's lap and the half-dozen signatures that asked for money in the name of hospitality. And he smelled the shine of a tidy arrest. He asked for papers and found them. Castañeda defended himself. He spoke straight, quoted codes, demanded respect. His eyes searched for allies and found none. The marshal cuffed him with a measured motion, like closing a drawer full of things he wouldn't be using again. The matchmaker Keen vanished among her dresses, but someone saw her climb into a northbound coach, leaving behind a trail of perfume and ink. The foreman swore he had only obeyed orders. The afternoon lay down on San Miguel del Viento like a tired beast. Elias, shirt open and shoulder bandaged, let Isora and Carmela carry him to a pallet in the back room. He sweated without asking permission. His breathing came in chords. He watched her from the corner of his eye when the pain loosened his jaw. You did it, he said. What had to be done and what nobody knew how to do. She pretended not to hear, busy tightening the bandage. He added with a low laugh that hurt him. I barely managed to be a wall. And I a bugle. Pretty bugle. Say that in public again and I'll stuff a rag in your mouth. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the threat like a blessing. The next week, the town picked up what the water had shifted. The shacks still stood, the gardens were saved, and the story of the language that had run through the hills spread. Some called it witchcraft, others mountain science, others had no name for it and just shook their heads. For Isora, It was a way of not dying all over again. With the ledger in the marshal's hands and the matchmaker gone, the plaza lost that stretched fairground tension. The market came back, the small noise of life. Some men came up to Izora with clumsy flowers and offers of a roof. She held out her torn-up letters like dried beetles, and they backed off because they had no idea what to do with their own guilt. Tomas Beltran hid behind his counter. They never spoke again. Elias healed slowly, with that silent stubbornness she recognized in animals. He worked one-handed at first, then with the other, then with both. Every evening, when the heat eased and the flies grew tired, Izora sat on the back threshold and whistled. It was no longer just nostalgia. It was teaching. The kids repeated her, and some of the men too, and a schoolteacher from town, Ruth, asked her to show the children how to write the whistles down as lines, so that someday, when people forgot to listen, a map would remain. Izora agreed with that mix of shyness and pride that rose in her whenever someone took her seriously. The first day Ruth drew a scale on the blackboard, Izora felt something in her bones slide into place a little better. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the cantina bearing a federal seal. It was from the marshal. He informed them that Castañeda was to be tried in Santa Fe for fraud and attempted murder. He put in dates, named witnesses, and at the end, in that dry prose of a man who knows he can't say much, he added, "The statement of Mrs. Morales and her notebook of signals will be useful to formally record the alarm that prevented loss of life." Izora read that and pressed her lips together so nothing that looked like emotion would escape. Ruth read over her shoulder and put a hand on her forearm and said nothing. Carmela made coffee that smelled like forgiveness. Elias came in from closing the corral, read too, and scratched the back of his neck with fingers that had lost some callus, a shy gesture. "You'll have to go to Santa Fe," he said. "People there think the written word kills whatever they don't understand. Then we'll have to whistle at them." "Not inside the courtroom, please. I have manners. I don't believe you. Nobody benefits from believing me. I do." They looked at each other with none of that shine you see on stage. There was a fine drizzle and the smell of firewood in the air. He said again, almost exactly as he had that first night, without solemnity, "Your voice makes the world softer." She answered with something else, "And your silence leaves me room to set the table." For other people, that exchange might have been sugar. For them, it was bread. They went to Santa Fe in a cheap coach, taking roofs so people couldn't say a barwoman and a cowboy were escorting a lady without a proper surname. The courthouse was clean, cold, with high windows. The judge listened, jotted notes, wrinkled papers and his brow. When Izora explained the chain of whistles, a lawyer smiled in scorn. Without asking permission, she raised 2 fingers to her lips and sent a single soft trill up to the ceiling, where it bounced and returned without fuss. "That, Your Honor," she said, "is like a telegraph without wire, older than hunger. If you like, we can call it peasant signaling. It works the same." The judge didn't smile. He asked for facts. She offered names, times, hills. Ruth produced the notebook of signs. Bit by bit, the judge stopped fighting the unusual and clung to what could be proven. Castañeda, pale with wounded pride, denied everything. One eye twitched. When he heard hot bread on the table for the umpteenth time, he tried to laugh, but the sound cracked and came out like a broken rooster. The prosecutor, who had looked half asleep the whole trial, woke up and asked the clerk if he had recorded the laugh. The clerk said laughs weren't recorded. The judge ordered the interruption to be entered. The people in the room breathed. On the 5th day, they sentenced him to prison. Izora didn't look at the ruined man. She looked at Ruth, who nodded like someone closing a book they know they'll open again. On the way back, the coach climbed sage-scented ravines. Halfway up a grade, a wheel hit a stone and the vehicle lurched. Elias got down, set his shoulder, used the log as a lever, and set the wheel back. Izora watched the effort without drama. Something inside her finally set a chair that had been wobbling since childhood. It wasn't romantic love she felt, but a certainty of house. When they reached San Miguel del Viento, the town greeted them with more noise than they deserved. There were rag garlands, a kid with an off-key flute, an old man offering a skinny goat. Isora accepted everything and then went out back and whistled a tune with no name. Elias waited for her to finish and said, "I've got a horse that still needs shoeing. And I have a long list of girls with clumsy tongues. We could make a deal. We could." They didn't talk about marriage. They talked about work. Months went by. The watermen built a new canal, with Hans' help and his iron patience. Ruth folded the whistled language into the school, and the children wrote their names in lines and curves. The cantina prospered because people loosened their coins when they no longer have to reach for their guns. The miners learned to signal accidents without mounting up. Carmela let herself paint the walls a loud blue that didn't apologize. Isora kept teaching, and at night, when the wind went soft, she and Elias sat on the roof and shared a piece of bread, oil, and onions. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. One day he showed her a small piece of metal. He had forged it with Han. It looked like a ring, but had no closed circle, more like a tiny horseshoe spiral. "It's not an engagement ring," he said. "It's a work ring." She looked at it with a gleam that had nothing to do with sentiment. "Then we'd better wear it out." He slipped it onto her little finger, not her ring finger, as if he knew symbols mattered, but shouldn't squeeze. And that was that, the way good things are. A year later, a party of tourists turned up with new cameras and ridiculous hats. They asked about the mail-order bride who talked to birds. Isora heard them, shook her head, and went on with her day. In the afternoon, one of them asked her to whistle for a photograph. She looked at him without smiling, with that patience that hurts, and said no. The man insisted. Elias came closer and stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and with a single word sent them away. He didn't shout. He used his voice like a thread you cut with your teeth. The tourists went off to look for some other curiosity. That night, yes, Isora whistled, but she did it toward the canyon, for no one carrying equipment. And one day a woman came with a plain skirt, work-roughened hands, and a mountain accent. She carried a baby in her arms and another child by the hand. She said she'd come from the north, that she had been brought by lying letters a year earlier, and had fled a nameless husband. She'd heard that here they taught you to speak without shouting. Isora sat her down, gave her water, taught her where to put her tongue, taught her to send a message to a hill that didn't exist yet. The woman cried without noise. The child repeated the trill, crooked but brave. And right there, Isora understood that the home she had chased in a letter was growing, bit by bit, without the map's permission. One morning, while the sun stretched slowly, Elias went down to the corral in his poncho, stood still a long moment, and came back up with a mild, serious air. He found Isora in the yard with the girls, teaching them the signal for rain. He leaned in the doorway, watched her work, said nothing. When the girls left, he walked toward her with the careful steps of a man carrying a skittish animal. From his pocket, he drew a leather thong. Hanging from it was a tiny bell made from the same spiral she wore on her finger. Roughly scratched into it were 3 lines and 1 curve, her signals. "It's ugly," he said, apologizing without knowing how. "Like us," she answered. "Nobody's going to steal it." He hung it from the doorframe. "It's so that when you go in or out, it rings just enough, not to warn the others, but so I know the world's in its place." She cupped his cheek, no ceremony, with fingers that had counted cows and letters. Kissing him would have been easy and would have turned everything into a story other people had already told. Instead, she raised the horn and whistled slowly. 4 notes that on her island meant, "I walk with you." He recognized them without ever having heard them and answered with his human voice, "So be it." And the bell, for pure mischief, chimed once. When the judge in Santa Fe sent a final paper months later, sentence written and seal still faintly warm, the town nailed it to the church door with a knife. Someone wrote underneath, in charcoal, a line that wasn't a legal ruling, just a summary. "Here the water won't belong to one man alone." Isora read it in passing and went on with her rounds. She ran into Tomas around the next corner. He lowered his gaze, twisted his hat in his hands, muttered something that might have been an apology, but never pulled itself together into a word. She didn't need that sound. She stepped aside with the same politeness you use to dodge a puddle. The world, despite what papers promise, doesn't fix the things that can't be fixed. And even so, at dusk, when the wind smelled of toasted flour, Isora climbed to the roof with Elias, and he, watching her work with the kids who still lingered, said without poetry, "People will talk and say you were saved. You saved me from going deaf from so much sun." She shrugged one shoulder, almost a laugh, and whistled for him once more. The sound crossed the valley, touched the hills, came back in echo. If someone in town heard it and felt their jaw slacken, if a horse pricked its ears, if a woman at the river let the laundry slip from her hands and just listened, that was their own business. For the two of them, sitting on the edge of the roof with their legs dangling and the ugly bell ringing for comings and goings, the world was finally at a livable volume. There was no need to say they loved each other or to wear rings that asked permission. It was enough to know that when she opened her mouth to speak, she no longer swallowed her shame. And that when he was quiet, he wasn't hiding. And when, a winter later, they decided to share beds and stove, there was no dance or carpet. There was bread on the table, truly hot, for the first time. He broke it with his hands and gave her the softest piece. She, abusing the trust between them, gave him the crust. They looked at each other like you look into a good mirror. And the bell rang again, not from the wind, but just because. There was no other vow than that. The town understood without decree that there had been a wedding, but nobody called it that. The children, for their part, learned a new signal that day. Invented by Isora and approved by Elias, 4 taps on the iron and a short whistle to mean home. They used it in storms, in small fires, for birth news, in farewells. And if anyone ever asked who had taught it to them, they answered with a shrug and a phrase that fit in no official record. It was a woman who came in a letter and stayed for her voice.